Some deaths make sense. Some don't. But the death of Alicia Benjamin defies logic. A young mother, found dead in her own home. 2 gunshot wounds to the head. A knife buried deep in her stomach. And yet, somehow, they called it suicide. Pause for a second. Let that sink in. 2 bullets to the head. A stab wound to the stomach. The official story? She did it to herself. But let's be honest, how many people do you know who shoot themselves in the head twice? How many people, in the midst of ending their own life, take the extra step to drive a blade into their own flesh? So deep that all left was the hilt of the kitchen knife? It doesn't add up. It never did. But in a world where stories are shaped by whoever is left alive to tell them, her death became a question mark. A case that should have been investigated turned into a file tucked away, dismissed, forgotten. Ruled as the most unbelievable suicide in the history of Michigan. The timing made it even worse. 3 days after her nemesis returned from jail. 3 days after she became afraid that her son might be abducted by her ex-boyfriend. The same man she sent to prison for stabbing her 5 years ago. Somehow, this should all add up. Perhaps this should be called a murder. But no, the coroners gave an official statement. Suicide. 3 years. 3 days between the moment her ex-boyfriend stepped out of prison and the moment she took her last breath. Coincidence? Or something far more sinister? Because this wasn't just any ex-boyfriend. This was a man with a past. A man who had already served time, already walked the thin line between freedom and a cell. A man whose release should have been a second chance, but instead, it became a countdown. To a mother's final moments. To the last time she was ever seen alive. To the night where something went terribly, terribly wrong. And yet, despite all the red flags, despite the wounds that screamed foul play, the case was closed. Wrapped up, filed away under suicide. But not everyone believed it. Not the people who knew her. Not the ones who loved her. Not the ones who knew how much she loved her little boy, Robinson, and how she was excited about her wedding in 8 months. She was an intending bride. She had just found love after a life of abuse. But all that was to be cut short. Suicide? Really? If you look closer, if you dig deeper, if you trace the moments that led up to her final breath, one thing becomes painfully clear: this might not have been suicide after all. But what do we know? To understand how she got here, we have to go back. To the beginning. To her life before him. Before the crime scene tape. Before the flashing lights. Before the whispers of suicide that never quite made sense. She was just a woman. A mother. A fighter. Alicia Benjamin had a life before the headlines. Before her name was reduced to another tragic story in the news cycle. Alicia had dreams. She had plans. She was supposed to be a wife and a mother. She had a future that should have stretched far beyond the night she died. She worked hard, balancing the challenges of single motherhood with the weight of her own ambitions. Whether it was a job, a side hustle, or just making sure her child had everything he needed, she never stopped. She did what she had to do. She wasn't the kind of woman who gave up easily. She wasn't the kind of woman who would go out like a coward. But on April 16, 2025, the story changed. Alicia Benjamin was a suicide victim. She'd taken her own life. So how did she end up here? How did a woman with so much to live for end up with 2 bullets in her skull and a knife in her stomach? The answer, like so many tragedies, starts with a man. Alicia met him at a time when she wasn't looking for love. But love has a way of finding people, even when they don't invite it in. At first, he was charming. That's how they always are in the beginning. Smooth. Confident. The kind of man who could talk his way into anything. She wasn't naive, she knew he had a past. She knew he wasn't perfect. But something about him pulled her in. Maybe it was the way he looked at her like she was the only person in the world. Maybe it was bus confidence. Maybe it was the way he made promises in that deep, convincing voice, the kind of promises you want to believe, even when you know better. Or maybe, just maybe, she thought she could save him. Maybe she had the motherly instinct of saving an amputee fresh out of jail. To fix. To heal. To take something broken and make it whole again. And he was broken. That much was obvious. He had a past. A record. A history of crime. But he told her he was different now. That he had changed. And she wanted to believe him. Because at the end of the day, everyone deserves a second chance, right? At least, that's what she thought. Until the second chance turned into the worst mistake of her life. Alicia Benjamin fell head over heels for him. His name was Damien Carter. He had just gotten out. He had spent years behind bars, and when he came out, he was missing something, his left leg. The story behind it? A prison fight so brutal, so savage, that by the time the guards got involved, the damage was done. The infection set in. And eventually, the doctors had no choice but to take his leg. Most men would have broken under that. Not Damien. He didn't walk into the gym like a broken man. He walked in like someone who had survived something unimaginable and came out stronger. And she noticed him immediately. He was special at the gym. He wasn't just the guy missing one leg. No. There was something about him. The way he carried himself, the way he moved, the way he looked at the world like he had seen things no one else had. Power. Mystery. He had both. And Alicia Benjamin found herself falling fast. At first, it was innocent. Conversations between workouts. Smiles exchanged between sets. She learned his story in pieces, she learned how he had made mistakes, how prison had changed him, how he just wanted a second chance. She believed him. Because he wasn't like the other men who had tried to impress her. He didn't brag. He didn't boast. He just was himself. And maybe that's why, when he asked for her number, she didn't hesitate. Maybe that's why, when he called her late at night, she always answered. Maybe that's why, when he whispered that he wanted to be better, that he wanted to turn over a new leaf, she believed him. Because Damien Carter didn't just talk. He promised. For a while, he tried. He got a job at a factory. Hard labor. Long hours. But he showed up, he put in the work, and for a moment, it seemed like maybe, just maybe, things would be okay. But then the layoffs happened. And just like that, he was out. He found another job at a barbershop. It was better, less physically demanding, more social, but it didn't last either. He had a temper. And one day, that temper got the best of him. A fight broke out in the shop. Chairs flipped. Fists swung and then there was blood on the floor. By the time the police arrived, the shop was wrecked. But Damien? He refused to press charges. Said it was just a fight between friends. But Alicia knew better. And that's when things changed between them. He no longer had a job. He now spent hours at home. 6 months before the night that changed everything, the police pulled him over. A firearm was found in his car. No permit. No explanation. For a man with a record, this should have been it. But somehow, he got out of it. Somehow, the authorities let him off. Said he knew who the gun belonged to. Gave them a name. Cooperated just enough to walk free. Alicia never asked questions. All she knew was that things were different after that. But just when she would have walked away, then came Robinson. Their son. Their second chance. And for a while, it worked. Damien tried. He really did. He promised he would be better for the baby. And Alicia wanted to believe him. Because how do you walk away from the father of your child? How do you look at the man you love and admit that maybe, just maybe, he will never be the man you need him to be? So she stayed. Even when he lost another job. Even when the bills piled up. Even when it became clear that he could never hold down anything stable. Even when he got into street fights, was deep in debts and arrested twice. She stayed. Because someone had to. But soon, Alicia realized that a baby needs more than love. A baby needs a home. Food. Clothes. And when Damien couldn't provide it, Alicia knew she had to step up. That's when she made the decision. The choice that changed everything. At first, it was just a job. A means to an end. All she had to do was dance at the strip club. She had danced before. It wasn't a big deal. And Damien? He knew what she did. He had always known. So at first, he didn't care. Until she started making real money. Until she started staying out later. Until she started hiring a babysitter so she could work extra shifts. And suddenly, the man who had once promised her freedom, promised her that she could be whoever she wanted to be, decided that she wasn't supposed to be that kind of woman. She was supposed to be home. She was supposed to take care of the baby. She was supposed to listen to him and do as told. And when she didn't, the fight started. First, they were small. But then they got worse. Damien wasn't the type of man who liked to be ignored. He wasn't the type of man who liked to be told no. And Alicia? She was the type of woman who refused to be controlled. Two people like that. They were never going to last. And somewhere deep down, Alicia knew it. She just didn't know how bad it was going to get. She didn't know that one day, it would come down to bullets and a knife. She didn't know that one day, she'd be found dead in a way that made no sense. Some people say you never really know a person until you refuse to play to their games. And on that night, in their small home in Michigan, Damien Carter showed Alicia Benjamin exactly who he was. It started with an argument. They had fought before, many times. But this time was different. This time, Damien wasn't just angry. He was desperate. Because no matter how much he tried, no matter how many times he told Alicia to quit, she wouldn't listen. She was still working. She was still stripping. She was still making more money than he ever could. And worst of all, she was providing for their son in a way he couldn't. And maybe this made him feel small. Weak. And Damian Carter was not a man who could handle feeling weak. He told her that if she wasn't going to listen, if she wasn't going to do what was right for their family, then maybe she didn't deserve their son. Maybe Robinson was better off without her. Alicia froze. Because this wasn't just some empty threat. Damian meant it. He wasn't just angry at her job. He wanted control. And now, he had found the one thing that would break her completely, her child. Alicia did the only thing she could. She told him she was calling the police. And that's when she saw the knife. It all happened so quickly. One moment he was yelling and the next, there was blood on the blade. Her heart stopped and then her legs burned. Then Damian didn't stop. No. It seemed he wanted to hurt her in ways she'd never recover. Through their son. He cut open the 2-year-old with the same knife. Alicia screamed, and that's when the neighbors had called 911. The screaming. The struggle. It was enough to make them take action. And when the police arrived, they found exactly what they expected. Alicia, barely conscious, losing blood fast. Robinson, badly hurt, but alive. And Damian? He'd fled the scene. Eventually, Damian was caught and made to face the consequences of his actions. The trial was quick. Domestic violence. Child endangerment. Assault with a deadly weapon. The jury didn't hesitate, he was sentenced. 6 years. Alicia thought that would be enough. Enough time for her to move on. Enough time for her to rebuild. But life doesn't always work like that. Because Damian wasn't supposed to get out. And yet, 4 years later, he walked free. Alicia didn't know how it happened. One day, she was safe. The next, she got the call. Damian Carter was out. Parole. Early release for good behavior. As if a few years in a cell had somehow erased everything he had done. As if he was a changed man and not the same abuser. As if the system had already forgotten that he had almost killed her. Almost killed their son. But Alicia hadn't forgotten. She never would. And deep down, she knew she wasn't safe. Her life would never be the same again. Because Damian was back. And this time, little did she know she would not survive him. Some deaths don't just happen. They leave behind unanswered questions, suspicions, a dark cloud that lingers over everyone left behind. When Alicia Parker's body was discovered, it wasn't just another tragic crime. It was an unsolved puzzle. Because 3 days. 3 days. That's all it took. That's all the time Damian Carter needed to walk out of prison and step back into the world before Alicia was found dead. Coincidence? Or unfinished business? We would never know. Alicia had survived everything life threw at her. She had endured everything in the hands of Damian. The fights. The threats. The night he stabbed her, twice. She survived it all. And when Damian was sent away, she finally had a chance to rebuild. Her wounds hadn't been life-threatening. The knife wounds in her legs were shallow, painful, but nothing stitches couldn't fix. The cut on her face was minor, barely leaving a scar. And Robinson, their son, the cut he suffered that night were terrifying, but they hadn't done permanent damage. The court had sent Damian to prison for 6 years. But there was always that looming possibility. That word that haunted victims everywhere, parole. Why was he released? It was the question that made no sense. Why? Why was Damian Carter, a man with a violent history, allowed to walk free? Some claimed it was due to good behavior. That he had spent his time inside staying quiet, avoiding trouble, proving that he was reformed. That he wasn't dangerous anymore. But not everyone believed that. Because there was another side to this story. A side where Damian wasn't just a violent man, he was a manipulator. Someone who could lie. Charm. Make people believe whatever he wanted them to believe. And if the system had fallen for it, if they had let him out thinking he was just another ex-con looking for a fresh start, then they simply made sure Alicia never stood a chance at life. April 16, 2024, the night Alicia died was supposed to be just another night. She was happy. Engaged. She had moved on, found love again. Her fiancé, Owen Matthews, was a man she trusted. A man who had promised her a better life. He wasn't some violent criminal. He wasn't a man with a past full of blood and broken promises. He was a doctor. Someone who saved lives. Alicia had escaped Damian, and now she was building something new. But maybe Damian didn't like that. Maybe the thought of her happy, without him, was something he couldn't accept. Or maybe, just maybe, this was never about love. Maybe it was about control. And maybe Alicia's final mistake was believing she was free. It started as an ordinary day. Owen went to work at the hospital. Alicia stayed home with Robinson. She had been anxious all morning, more than usual. Owen told the police about how uneasy she felt after Damian was released. But maybe, it wasn't just a feeling she had. Maybe it wasn't just anxiety. Maybe she knew something wasn't right. She told Owen not to send Robinson to school that day. She was afraid. Afraid that Damian would try to see him. Afraid that he would come back into their lives. Owen assured her everything would be fine. How could Damian do anything? He was out of prison, but he had no money, no home, nothing. Alicia had one. Or at least, that's what they thought. Because when Owen got home that evening, everything had changed. He walked through the door and there she was. Alicia. Lying on the floor. Still. Bleeding. Her body cold. And Robinson? Their son. He was in the bedroom, just a few feet away. Sobbing. Crying for his mother with the door locked. And there was nothing Owen could do. He called 911. He tried to save her. But it was already too late. Alicia Benjamin was dead. And in the most gruesome way possible. The evidence was strange. Alicia had been shot, twice, in the head. A classic execution-style killing. But that wasn't all. She also had a knife wound in her stomach. That didn't make sense. Why would someone shoot her, twice, then stab her? Was this personal? A message? A crime of passion? The police needed answers. And they started with the one person who had been with her that night. Robinson. When officers asked Robinson what happened, the little boy had little to say. He hadn't seen anything. But he had heard it. He had heard his mommy crying. He had heard her shouting. Gunshots. And after that? Nothing. Just silence. Robinson said he didn't know if anyone else was with her during the incident. But no one had come to visit them before then. But could the little boy be right? Or was the killer so stealthy he couldn't have heard anything? The question remained. If Alicia was incapable of shooting herself in the head with a gun and still stabbing herself to death, then who killed her? The obvious suspect was Damien Carter. He had just been released. He had a history of violence. And Alicia had been terrified of him. But there was a problem. Damien had an alibi. That night, he wasn't alone. He had been staying at his uncle's house, along with 2 other men. They all swore he had been there the entire time. Sleeping. If Damien didn't do it, then who did? Was it someone from Alicia's past? Had she made an enemy she didn't even know about? Was this an unrelated crime? Or was this a perfectly planned murder, where the real killer walked free, leaving nothing behind? To this day, there is no evidence linking Damien Carter to Alicia Parker's murder. But people still wonder. Could he have hired someone? Could he have manipulated another person into doing his dirty work? Was this his way of getting revenge without getting his hands dirty? Or did he simply walk away, untouched, innocent, free? Alicia Parker was not supposed to die. She was a mother. A survivor. She was a woman who had finally found her way back to happiness, only to have it ripped away in the most brutal way imaginable. Her murder remains unsolved because if her killer is still out there, then perhaps, the story isn't over yet. And even in death, Alicia can get the justice she deserves.